In the shared recollection of the Second World War, hardly any visuals possess the comparable burden of threat and strength as the launching deck of a Japanese aircraft carrier. We visualize the crimson sun emblazoned on the timber flooring, the thunder of Nakajima torpedo planes, and the regimented lines of aviators prepared to perish for their sovereign. This force was the Kido Butai, the offensive arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was an instrument that drained a country at Pearl Harbor, brought a worldwide dominion to its knees in the Indian Ocean, and for a brief, horrific instant appeared ready to seize the entire Pacific. These vessels, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, were the uncontested monarchs of the sea, the absolute emblem of Japan's martial rise. However, what if this whole panorama, so deeply rooted in our past, is lacking? What if I revealed to you that a different squadron of aviation ships navigated under the banner of the rising sun? A clandestine armada conceived not from the majestic naval tactics discussed by commanders, but from suspicion, aspiration, and a resentful domestic conflict that burned for decades, distant from any combat zone. This was not an instrument the Imperial Navy honored. It was an instrument they were unable to even regulate. Was it feasible for a dominion to own two navies, each operating in the obscurity of the other? This is the tale of that Phantom Squadron, a strange assortment of vessels that were in numerous aspects decades ahead of their era, merging the functions of troop carrier, aviation platform, and assault command ship into one groundbreaking hull. This is the chronicle of an instrument constructed in rebellion against Japan's own martial hierarchy. It is the tale of the Imperial Japanese Army's aircraft carrier and its overlooked giant, the Akitsu Maru. To comprehend how such an implausible vessel could ever materialize, we must first travel into the core of the toxicity that circulated through the arteries of the Japanese Empire. What sort of internal malady could compel an army to construct its own naval force? To grasp the reality of an army aviation ship, one must initially realize that for almost 100 years, the Japanese Empire was a residence split against itself. This was no basic inter-service contest, no amiable competition over a sporting match. This was a profound, systemic, and poisonous rift, with origins reaching back to the very genesis of modern Japan in the 19th century. It was a silent war waged not with agents and puppet nations, but in financial gatherings, in manufacturing distributions, and in the overarching tactical mapping for the spirit of the country itself. It was a struggle that would eventually turn out as lethal to the empire as any American maritime battle group. The genesis of this toxicity goes back to the Meiji Restoration of 1868. The uprising that toppled the centuries-old Tokugawa shogunate and propelled Japan into the contemporary era was not a cohesive public rebellion. It was a strained alliance of dominant feudal families. The two most significant of these were the Choshu and the Satsuma. By historical custom and geographic truth, the Choshu clan, with its entrenched terrestrial strength, came to rule the new Imperial Japanese Army. The Satsuma, a seafaring society from Japan's southern point, instinctively constituted the core of the Imperial Japanese Navy.
Theirs was a forced marriage, a collaboration of necessity to eradicate a shared foe. However, once the shogun was removed, the ancient animosities rotted. For the ensuing 70 years, these two groups would handle the Japanese administration not as a superior to be obeyed, but as a reward to be captured. Was this alliance fated to crack from its very beginning? This separation grew from a political contest into a total strategic madness. The army, fixated on its samurai heritage and the tutorials of the Russo-Japanese War, envisioned the destiny of the empire on the Asian mainland. Their philosophy, termed Hokushin, or the Northern Expansion Doctrine, called for a colossal land force to capture the assets of Manchuria and get ready for a conclusive, catastrophic conflict with the Soviet Union in Siberia. From their perspective, the Navy was scarcely more than a ferry operation. The Navy, conversely, was patterned after Britain's Royal Navy. Its commanders were more cosmopolitan, its outlook directed outward toward the immense Pacific. Their philosophy, Nanshin, or the Southern Expansion Doctrine, envisioned the future in capturing the petroleum-wealthy Dutch East Indies and the raw materials of Southeast Asia. This would unavoidably result in a decisive naval confrontation with the United States. To the admirals, the Army's perpetual sanguine swamp in China was a disastrous exhaustion of the metal, fuel, and labor required to construct their massive battleships. How can a country get ready for combat when its two hands are attempting to strike in opposing trajectories? This strategic separation resulted in actions of reciprocal undermining that border on the inconceivable. The two branches stockpiled information from each other as though they were alien nations. They engineered essential armament systems in total seclusion, declining to exchange technology or knowledge. The Army, persuaded the Navy would desert its supply lines, started planning and constructing its own cargo submarines to provision its secluded island outposts. The Navy, requiring the ability to deposit its elite marine troops on hostile beaches, engineered its own amphibious armor without ever asking the Army's far more seasoned tank engineers. It was a country fighting the globe, and concurrently, a country fighting itself. Nowhere would this domestic struggle have more fatal ramifications than in the single sector where collaboration was not merely recommended, but entirely distinct for existence. What occurs when this fractured apparatus is required to execute the most intricate of all martial maneuvers, an amphibious assault? The immense Pacific War, a struggle characterized by thousands of isles dispersed across millions of square miles of sea, offered the Imperial Japanese Army a frightening and unavoidable reality. To triumph, they had to transport hundreds of thousands of troops, their armor, their heavy guns, and their provisions across the ocean and deposit them on antagonistic, deeply defended shores. For this, an organization founded on centuries of soil-based samurai custom was totally, shamefully reliant on the very adversary they loathed, the Imperial Navy. The Army could subjugate a mainland, yet it could not even traverse a strait without requesting authorization.
This was the oppression of the ocean, and it was a tactical jail from which there appeared to be no exit. Every solitary amphibious mission, from the massive invasions of the Philippines and Malaya to the tiniest island jump, necessitated the Army's haughty generals to go hat in hand to the admirals. They were forced to beg for transport, petition for destroyer guards to shield their exposed carriers, and most crucially fawn for the aerial protection from the Navy's cherished aircraft carriers. Without command of the heavens, any landing party was an easy target, destined to be wiped out by hostile aircraft before a single trooper placed a foot on the sand. To the Army's command, this reliance was more than a supply chain annoyance. It was a profound spiritual disgrace. They viewed the Navy not as an ally, but as a volatile and conceited sentry, one who grasped the lives of Army troops in its palms and frequently appeared ready to let them fall. This boiling anger erupted into total conviction of treachery during the savage attrition campaign for Guadalcanal in 1942. Here, the Army's bleakest anxieties were actualized in the most ghastly manner conceivable. Repeatedly, Navy battle groups would guide Army carriers to the Isle, deposit men and a few days of provisions ashore, and then disappear over the skyline, speeding off to battle the Americans in what the Army viewed as flashy, strategically meaningless duels between combat ships. They were charged with deserting the supply ships at the initial hint of danger, always ranking the security of their valued carriers and battleships above the existence of the troops they were obligated to be assisting. The consequence was a disaster.
The Tokyo Express transformed into a one-way passage to ruin, with army supply routes cut, abandoning thousands of troops to famine, to yield to sickness, and to be massacred on what they bitterly labeled Starvation Island. The moral of Guadalcanal was inscribed in the gore and skeletons of a whole division. It was the supreme, irrefutable evidence of what the Army had long surmised. The Navy could not be relied upon. They were waging a separate conflict for separate goals, with a separate explanation of glory. The Army arrived at a drastic, nearly blasphemous deduction. If endurance and triumph relied on extending force across the ocean, and the Navy was an untrustworthy ally, then the Army would have to handle it themselves. They would be forced to shatter the Navy's exclusivity on naval strength. They required vessels that could transport their troops, deposit their tanks, and most boldly dispatch their own planes. How could an army, an establishment of terrestrial might, even commence to provoke the deities of the ocean at their own sport? The Army's response to this emergency of reliance was not conceived in a singular spark of brilliance. It was a progression, a gradual and intentional voyage into a domain of military science where they had no license to exist. This blasphemous remedy, the concept of an army-governed amphibious group, commenced years prior to Pearl Harbor, with a vessel that outwardly appeared like a benign commercial cargo ship. However, underneath her mercantile camouflage, she was an instrument as groundbreaking as any battleship of the time. Her designation was the Akitsu Maru, and she was the testbed for the Army's personal navy.
Launched in 1934, she was the globe's first specifically engineered landing vessel, a ship planned from the bottom up to resolve the lethal issue of moving men from boat to beach under attack. The breakthroughs concealed inside her frame were nothing less than a massive advancement. For decades, the standard technique of amphibious attack was a sluggish, awkward, and self-destructive procedure. Halt the transport vessels, utilize hoists to lower tiny landing skiffs over the rail one at a time, and observe as they were sniped by coastal artillery while they leisurely assembled into assault lines. The Akitsu Maru made this outdated. Deep inside her interior, she held a floodable well deck. At the instant of the assault, gigantic rear and lateral doors would part, permitting the ocean to rush in. Within this spacious, sheltered garage, nearly 30 Daihatsu-class landing boats already packed with soldiers and gear would float loose and power out from the parent vessel in a singular, synchronized, high-velocity surge. Was this the most significant maritime invention that no navy had ever conceived? However, the Akitsu Maru possessed another mystery. She could also bear aircraft, launching them from a seemingly simple catapult on her surface. The idea was a dazzling triumph in the initial invasions of China and Southeast Asia, demonstrating the Army's theory was valid. Yet it also exposed a vital restriction. A catapult could only dispatch a few scout planes gradually, one by one. It was unable to supply the persistent reactive aerial shield required to guard a landing party. The genuine ambition, the supreme manifestation of the Army's defiance, was a complete flight deck, a vessel that could dispatch and retrieve its own planes, utilizing its own aviators, entirely free of the Navy's impulses. As the Pacific War exploded, the unquenchable need for transport offered the Army its opportunity. In a shocking demonstration of political clout, the Army simply appropriated two massive passenger cruise ships that were already under fabrication, seizing them for their own classified venture before the stunned Navy could demand them. These civilian frames, intended for opulence and relaxation, would now become the easel for the Army's magnum opus of martial resistance. What sort of beast would be generated when the physique of a cruise ship was welded with the aspirations of an army? To genuinely value the extreme character of the Akitsu Maru, we must analyze this mixed giant. She was not simply a boat. She was an independent military philosophy cast in iron.
To a naval purist, her outline would have been a baffling, nearly insulting vision. She held the extended flat roof of an aircraft carrier, yet she rode deeply in the sea with the tall sides of a passenger liner. She possessed no graceful cruiser nose, no bristling collection of naval guns. She was a hybrid, a being of two realms, pertaining wholly to neither. And it was in this specific mixed essence that her groundbreaking brilliance and perhaps her final weakness was hidden. What occurs when you blend two distinct varieties of warship into one? Let us start with the most observable characteristic, the aviation deck. At 123 meters, or 404 feet, it was a decent magnitude, yet considerably shorter than that of a fleet carrier like the Shokaku, and even tinier than the surfaces of many escort carriers the Navy was constructing.
There was no reinforced metal to shield against explosives, no potent steam launchers to throw heavy planes, and most notably, no capture cables to hook the swift-landing naval interceptor. It was a basic, unadorned strip of timber boards placed over a modified superstructure. This was not a defect in her engineering. It was a proclamation of her intent. This surface was never intended to accommodate the Navy's high-spec Zeros or Kate torpedo bombers. It did not need to. The Army was waging a separate conflict, and it possessed its own very distinct machines. Her main aerial resource was the Kokusai K-76, a plane the Allies would subsequently label Stella. It was for all practical purposes a Japanese replica of the famous German Fieseler Storch, one of the most extraordinary planes of the conflict. The K-76 was no aerial duelist. It was sluggish, awkward, and defenseless. However, it held a nearly supernatural talent: short takeoff and landing, or STOL. With its gigantic high-lift flaps and robust motor, it could jump into the sky in under 70 meters and touch down at a velocity slower than a cycle. This rendered it the ideal companion for the Akitsu Maru's abbreviated, sparse airstrip. Its function was to serve as the eyes of the invasion group leader, flying low and slow above the combat zone, identifying concealed enemy automatic weapon positions, guiding artillery bombardment with exact precision, and supplying live intelligence straight to the soldiers struggling on the sand beneath. Was this machine the absent connection between the ocean and the coast? Yet the Akitsu Maru was also scheduled to transport a much weirder device, a glimpse of a future yet to arrive, the Kayaba Ka-1 autogyro. It was not a helicopter. Its primary blade was unpowered, rotating loosely like a maple seed in the breeze to supply lift, while a standard propeller at the nose dragged it through the sky. The Army perceived a distinct possibility in this strange gadget for the most perilous sport of all: anti-submarine combat. The hypothesis was that a squadron of these slow-moving autogyros, fitted with tiny depth charges or flares, could hang for hours above a supply line. Their steadiness and incredibly reduced velocity would render them perfect submarine locators, capable of sensing the underwater silhouette of a U.S. sub far superior to a fast-moving scout aircraft. It was a creative, if unproven, answer to the singular biggest danger to Japan's war attempt. Yet could such a delicate-appearing device actually stalk the most lethal hunters of the abyss? As groundbreaking as her air wing was, the real mystery of the Akitsu Maru resided deep inside her frame, in an area that was once intended for luggage storage and machine rooms. The flight deck rendered her an aircraft carrier, but the well deck rendered her an invasion tip of the spear. At the decisive instant of an attack, gigantic rear doors would swing wide. The vessel's stability tanks would be inundated, causing her rear to sink deep into the ocean. Inside the spacious, now water-filled well deck, 20 fully packed Daihatsu-class landing boats would drift loose from their supports. These were the tough, flat-bottomed laborers of the beach, each able to transport 70 men or a light tank straight onto a shore via a clever nose ramp. With their motors shouting to life, they would power out from the shielding steel womb of the parent vessel and dash toward the coast in a flawlessly synchronized surge. This method, a literal forefather of the one utilized by contemporary navies, permitted the Akitsu Maru to unload nearly a whole infantry battalion with a swiftness, effectiveness, and security that no other vessel on Earth could equal. She was an independent invasion group, an instrument that could ferry an army, land it, and then assisted with its own aerial shield. On documents, she was the most sophisticated amphibious ship on the globe. With such a forward-thinking design, why did she never once execute the task for which she was so ingeniously created? The magnificent dream of the Akitsu Maru, heading a powerful army armada to subjugate remote fortified coasts, was a fantasy that would perish on the launch ramp. By the time she and her sibling vessel, the Nigitsu Maru, joined service in late 1942 and early 1943, the flow of the conflict had permanently shifted against Japan. The conclusive naval loss at Midway had broken the WWII. The savage wearing down at Guadalcanal had drained the Army pale. The rising sun was starting to descend across the Pacific. The era of bold offensive drives, of lightning victories, and unrestrained growth were finished. Japan was now trapped in a frantic, eroding battle for its very existence. The most cutting-edge amphibious attack vessel in the world had come to the celebration just as the illumination was being extinguished. What is the destiny of a blade that is hammered just as the fight is forfeited? This fresh, bleak truth meant the Army's groundbreaking assault vessels found themselves devoid of a purpose. There were no more shores to attack. There were only outposts to be provisioned and bolstered in a vain effort to maintain the collapsing boundary of a dying dominion. Thus, the Akitsu Maru's magnificent future as a battlefield leader was substituted by the ordinary, horrifying truth of being a high-velocity cargo ship. Her groundbreaking attributes, the very cause for her being, were mostly disregarded or reassigned for trivial chores. The floodable well deck, engineered for a theatrical high-intensity landing, was frequently just filled with standard freight. The flight deck, meant to be a center of live battlefield observation, became scarcely more than a storage yard for transporting dismantled planes from plants in Japan to distant island bases. She was a purebred racer being utilized as a plow beast, a perpetual nagging memory of a grand tactic that had already collapsed. How must it have seemed for the people who engineered her to witness their dream of dominion diminished to a supply route? This reduction was not merely a slight to her engineering, it was a capital punishment. Her new function compelled her to navigate the very shipping routes that the United States Navy's submarine fleet, the Silent Service, was methodically transforming into a cemetery. American leaders, equipped with brilliant code-breaking data, were conducting a ruinously efficient war of erosion against Japanese logistics, choking the island empire of its vital fluids, petroleum, iron, and troops. The seas between the home islands and the southern theater transformed into a corridor of hidden killers, a location the seamen bleakly called Torpedo Alley. For a massive, high-worth mark like the Akitsu Maru, every trip was a throw of the cubes. How many times could she navigate through the killing fields before her fortune expired?
The response arrived on January 12, 1944. Her sibling vessel, the Nigitsu Maru, was powering from Palau to the primary naval hub at Truk. Her storage packed with building staff and essential goods. She was identified by the American submarine, the USS Hake. The Hake's captain calmly released a volley of 4 torpedoes. 2 of them crashed into the Nigitsu Maru's frame. The adapted liner, filled with gasoline and explosives, did not submerge. She fell apart. A catastrophic blast ripped her asunder, and she disappeared beneath the ripples in merely 6 minutes, dragging nearly 600 souls with her. The initial of the Army's Phantom carriers was now a phantom in reality, a crypt of bent iron at the floor of the Pacific. Her sibling, the Akitsu Maru, was now solitary. How long could this single remnant, this vessel born of a collapsed fantasy, possibly escape the stalkers that now infested the oceans? By the fall of 1944, the Japanese war attempt was in its final spasms. General Douglas MacArthur had kept his renowned vow and arrived back in the Philippines. In the monumental Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively stopped existing as a unified combat group. Its carriers drowned, its battleships broken. Now the conflict had turned into a savage, hopeless terrestrial fight, and the Imperial Army was pouring every accessible man and engine into the slaughterhouse of Leyte. It was in this climate of a final frantic wager that the Akitsu Maru was given her ultimate deadly task. She was to be the command ship of convoy He-81, a vital bolstering convoy headed from Japan to the Philippines. Her freight was the totality of the IJA's 23rd Division, thousands of troops who symbolized the final greatest prospect to reverse the flow on land. The Akitsu Maru was no longer a botched idea or a modest carrier. She was an ark bearing the destiny of an entire army inside her frame. But as the group powered out of Japan on November 14th, it was already being stalked. Under the swells, the American submarine USS Queenfish, under the leadership of the combative and extremely capable Commander Charles Laughlin, was on the hunt. This was not destined to be a random meeting. American cryptologists, the quiet champions of the Pacific War, had caught and unscrambled Japanese naval transmissions. They understood the convoy's path, its velocity, its load, and its endpoint. The Queenfish was not looking for a needle in a haystack. It was being guided straight to a killing. For the thousands of men aboard the Akitsu Maru, their destiny had been finalized by radio signals they never knew existed. How can you evade a snare when the adversary comprehends your every action before you take it? On the tempestuous night of November 15th, in the chaotic seas of the Korea Strait, observers aboard the Queenfish noticed the black outlines of the Japanese convoy against the skyline. Commander Laughlin carefully steered his vessel, a 1,500-ton steel Predator, into an ideal shooting location. Via the scope, he recognized the biggest vessel in the group. With her flat roof, he incorrectly identified her as a naval escort carrier. Yet it was irrelevant. She was the core of the convoy, the primary objective. It was the Akitsu Maru. Just past 10 p.m., with the distance and direction verified, Laughlin issued the steady, hushed commands that would release chaos. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. 4 Mark 18 electric torpedoes raced quietly through the dark ocean.
Their arrival hidden by the storm-churned waves on the bridge of the Akitsu Maru, the observers noticed nothing. The initial torpedo impacted the vessel near the rear machine chamber, a disabling, stomach-turning hit that ripped open her frame and destroyed her capacity to travel. Seconds later, the second torpedo located its target. This one struck further back in a portion of the vessel filled with the munitions, gasoline, and explosives for the unit she was transporting. The outcome was a catastrophe. A dazzling, blinding flare illuminated the evening heavens as the Akitsu Maru was ripped asunder by a massive interior blast. The explosion was so potent it gasified the middle of the vessel, throwing wreckage for miles and severely impairing a nearby destroyer. For the thousands of troops of the 23rd Division packed in the modified passenger levels beneath, there was no alert, no opportunity to flee. There was only immediate burning nothingness. The vessel, snapped in half, submerged in under 3 minutes. She carried with her the convoy leader, her master, her staff, and over 2,000 troops of the 23rd Division. It was a bewildering waste of life and a ruinous, permanent hit to the Japanese protection of the Philippines. What ultimate horrific mystery is held by a vessel that was planned to commence invasions, but whose sole fate was to turn into a grave? In the concluding assessment, what is the heritage of this peculiar doomed vessel? Evaluated purely within the setting of the Second World War, the Akitsu Maru must be deemed a flop.
She was an instrument imagined for a conflict of expansion. At the specific instant, her country was being coerced into a frantic conflict of erasure, generated from a poisonous domestic competition that was a fatal frailty in the Japanese military engine. She joined duty too late to ever satisfy her groundbreaking intent. Her service was one of disappointment, her finale a burning, nameless calamity in the frigid Black Ocean. The very inter-service struggle that acted as her forge was a flawless miniature of the tactical decay that aided in dooming the Japanese Empire. However, the malfunction was in the scheduling, not in the concept. The concept itself was nothing less than prophetic. Review her central idea one final time: a solitary ship with a full-length flight deck for managing aircraft, joined with an interior floodable well deck for dispatching landing boats. Now gaze at this. This is the USS America, the primary vessel of the most recent type of amphibious assault ships in the United States Navy. She is the focal point of American Expeditionary Force extension. She transports F-35B Lightning II stealth fighters and a fleet of helicopters on her flight deck, while dispatching high-speed hovercraft and landing boats from her well deck. She can place a group of almost 2,000 Marines ashore and back them with her own unified aerial strength. She is, in theory, the very identical concept spearheaded by the Imperial Japanese Army 80 years prior. The Akitsu Maru was a reverberation from tomorrow. It was a vessel that flawlessly, nearly clairvoyantly forecasted the development of amphibious combat for the subsequent century. It was the correct thought at exactly the incorrect moment, battling for the incorrect dominion, generated from struggle and concluding in disaster. This disregarded phantom carrier stands as one of history's most captivating and educational what-ifs, a witness to a juncture when a suspicious and aspiring army, in its frantic attempt for autonomy, inadvertently constructed the warship of the future. How many additional mysteries generated from conflict and misplaced time are still anticipating to be found at the floor of the ocean?